India is one of the largest, fifth largest user of wind energy. Tamil Nadu and Gujarat are front runners in that arena. Today the grid is consisting of two parts, the northern grid and the southern grid. They are connected through what are called DC grid lines. There are some advantages, some disadvantages to having that separation, but generally advantages will be have one, and in 2014 the whole grid will be one large connected electrical synchronous grid. Okay?
One small question. How much would the solar contribution would be in this
Solar
renewable?
is 2-3%, very small.
I see.
Lots of ways to go. That's an optimistic number. We really don't know how many of the installed capacity generates electricity. Because of this requirement of the sun, we don't know at any point in time how much is there.
Thank you.
Any other question? Okay. By the way, I'm known to ask surprise quizzes at the end of my talks. So take notes as you go along. Okay, so the second motivation is, compared to non-renewable energy, which is something we have all known for a long time, renewable energies are taking over. And the problem with this is, what's the problem with renewable energies, energy sources? I gave you the clue before, the answer before. They're everywhere. And they come and go. So understanding the total amount of energy generated at any point in time becomes more difficult. So that is both a challenge and a problem. Problem because it's harder to do. Challenge and an opportunity. Challenge because things are distributed and decentralized in decision-making terms. But an opportunity because the larger they are, the less reliance we'll have to have on non-renewable sources, which are more polluting than these. Okay? So the motivation for the second one, the second motivation rather, is that multiple sources of energy need to be integrated. Is this clear?
There is a question from Ratnagiri.
Okay.
There is a question from Ratnagiri. Dr. Shashikant Goilkar. What was the generation's frequency at recent blackouts?
What was the?
Generation frequency at recent blackouts.
Well, I've given you the frequency diagram here. It started at 49.65, which is acceptable. Slowly started to diverge within a couple of seconds, spanning 49.65 at the top here, and 49.5, about a difference of 0.25 hertz. And subsequently, it reached 42 at the bottom. Things started to close down. So the answer to the question is, this picture says the whole story. Hope that answers this question. Any other query or comment? The third motivation is that in reality, especially when you have larger generation capacity than consumption requirements, about 30% of generation capacity is idle, is used only 10% of the time. Even in India, that's the case in lean seasons, winter seasons in particular. Now, capacity idling is a bad thing, right? Because number one, it starts to deteriorate with time that is not used. It starts to build up your capital costs that you're not paying back. So all of that means that you want to reduce the distance between installed and used capacity. Correct? How do you do that? Now, if you look at this picture, it's a bit busy. I'll take you through this. We are showing along the timeline the gigawatts that is being used in a certain area. There is a curve which goes like this that shows the consumption graph. During the night, consumption is low. During the daytime, because people turn on their ACs and stuff like that and buildings are occupied, consumption increases. So the separation between lowest point and the highest point shows the spread of consumption. You with me so far? Whereas if I were to somehow move this consumption up here to this level and bring that down to this level, the separation decreases compared to the original graph. How do I make that happen? See the problem here? I want to reduce or decrease the max to min consumption profile. What we can do is, during the lean consumption period, which is here, we store the energy in batteries or some other means. And during peak periods of consumption, use the battery to bring the consumption from the grid down. It's very simple to say. It's a good diversion. Is somebody trying to send a message? Okay. So, please keep your cell phones in silent because we don't have too much time to finish the rest of the slides. So the point is that by using storage devices, and what are storage devices in the internet? Caches and content distribution network, locations where data is stored, and so on. So similarly, we can have locations in the grid where energy is stored. How many of you have an inverter at home? Quite a few. So we normally use it to avoid the effect of blackouts, which are usually negative, right? But what I'm suggesting to you is, soon enough, there'll be a point where the pricing will be higher. Price of electricity will be higher during peak consumption periods. So rather than you going to the grid to get your electrical energy satisfied, need satisfied, go to your battery. Now what's the downside to that? When you need it, it may not be there. Your battery might be all used up. So you have to be judicious in using the battery at the right time so that when you need it, it's there. And when you need it, you can also use it to reduce your energy bills. And so that brings up the question of how do you predict what the needs are so that you can divide the needs between the grid and the battery. I'll come to that in a second. The other, I don't see any AC ducts here or AC units here, but in the older buildings, there'll be several split AC units. And the first thing that people do when they enter a hall or start a meeting, maybe a few minutes before the meeting starts, is to turn on all the ACs. Right? And even at home, when we have multiple ACs, we turn all of them all together. This is what happens. Suddenly, power requirement for that room or hall increases. It cools down, all of them shut down for a short period, and then they all warm up again. This oscillatory behavior leads to the same phenomenon that we saw in the previous slide. The separation between peak and minimum consumption gets larger the more the number of ACs that we have in a certain situation. And so what we have to do is something called flattening the peak, like we saw in the previous slide. So make this turning on of these devices happen more intelligently one after the other. Of course, it does mean that it's going to take a little longer for the room to be getting to a comfort level, temperature-wise. But that might be okay if you start slightly early. So again, smartness is called for. Right? So devices have to be controlled in such a way that peak demands are reduced and outages are avoided. Outages happen when the peak at all places of consumption occurs at the same time, which is why around 12 o'clock or 2 o'clock in the afternoon, sudden blackouts or brownouts happen in cities, because everybody is having their ACs on. We can't avoid that. We have to be comfortable in our environment. But those turning on of ACs can be done more intelligently through proper scheduling of the devices. Okay, so here is where the problem statement starts. We are going from grids to smart grids. Smart grids incorporate diverse energy sources, advanced monitoring to understand the requirements, the state of affairs in the grid, needs and so on. Managing the demand side by proper scheduling, and the ability to self-heal, meaning that if there are failures, adjusting the loads and the generation points in an intelligent fashion. And it's been recognized that information technology innovations are critical for the realization of smart grids, because all of this is about information being gathered, consumed, transmitted to the right places for both online decisions and human-based decisions. Okay? And in fact, the recommendations of the committee that I mentioned before, which went into the blackout and how to avoid them again, or from occurring again, has ICT as one of the major ingredients of any future solution to this problem. Scheduled, how we need to avoid unnecessary consumption, and so forth. And so now we need to identify specific research questions. And if you've done this right, this is automatically going to be unraveling in front of you. And this is the statement that we started our work with. The overarching goal is to build robust and deployable smart grid solutions. And I want you to take away these phrases. One is real-time demand response management. Is that clear by now? Managing demand and response to the demand in real time. Very simple. To do that, you have to do sensing and control of the grid elements being solutions. And I want you to take away these phrases. One is real-time demand response management. Is that clear by now? Managing demand and response to the demand in real time. Very simple. To do that, you have to do sensing and control of the grid elements being consumption points, transmission points, and so forth. I won't take you through this busy diagram. Now, the important thing is that we can't just throw sensors into the picture wherever we want, because they cost money. Each PMU costs several tens of lakhs of rupees. We are trying to indigenize them as we speak, but it's not going to go down in price much in an appreciable fashion. Now, users have to be persuaded to participate. Why is that? Any idea? Just keep thinking about why users may not want to participate in this exercise. Now, we have to put monitoring points or sensors inside homes. Right? We need to measure how much consumption takes place when, by how many people in a building, and so on. What are the issues? One is privacy. I can't advertise who is home when. It's a nice source of ready-made information for miscreants to enter your home or your room when you're not there and do things which are harmful, obviously. More importantly, these sensors cost money. Somebody has to convince the users, the customers, the clients like you and me, that there is a good payoff for the investment that the users have to make. So some amount of persuasion, feedback from the users. To collect information, we have to find out some data which may not be easily available, even through sensors. And we have to do all of this in the process of preserving user data privacy. Okay, is the statement of the problem clear? Each of these is a research area. So humans have to be part of the grid, not just the decision makers, but also the customers and consumers of energy. So the themes which have been identified, and you may want to remember some of these depending on your background, because these are all research areas wanting people to work in based on your background and interests. Demand response management, sensing and control, human in the loop behavior, and privacy, security, and database related issues at the bottom. Okay? By the way, I teach a course in IIT. You can go to my webpage and look at my course list. The last item in that list will be a course called New Topics in IT. And this semester I'm teaching that course on smart grids. So if you want to follow up on this topic, that's a good place to go. Lots of papers, lots of interesting research ideas, project ideas are listed there. This is for both professors as well as students. Having identified the research problems, next goal is to conduct the research required to answer those questions raised in the previous step. And that requires data collection, preparing the background. All of us are not going to be conversant with all aspects of the grid, for example. Setting up the system for measuring things and for data collection, developing the algorithms, conducting the experiments, and then finally analyzing and interpreting the results. And this is a cycle. It repeats itself until people are happy. Each of these steps at the end of it could lead to interesting insights which lead to the next set of questions to ask. Okay? Is this clear? The implication on research methodology. So what we did, I won't go through all the slides from now on. I'll just mention some of the details which are relevant to specific problems that we have addressed. I showed you this picture before, flattening the peak. We in fact instrumented our lab, which has 8 ACs, going back 10 years, so that consumption of energy for AC purposes, for cooling purposes, is minimized. It's flattened. So what you see here is a staggering of the execution of the ACs, very much like here. This is the cooling period of one AC, when it's turned off at the bottom, where this is the lowest of the band which you want to maintain, from 26 to 23. Where as soon as it comes close to 23, it's turned off. The AC zone warms up. As it comes close to this, it's turned on again, and it repeats. What you see here is a simple picture of 2 ACs turning on and off alternatively. Simplest of the pictures to illustrate the problem and the solution. Okay? And there's a generalized solution for this. You have to make sure that the comfort band will be acceptable and is achievable. It's called feasibility analysis. So a lot of interesting science and technology and practical implementation-oriented problems arise in the process. In terms of battery, what I mentioned earlier, the question is, you're given several batteries, and there's a workload, and the grid is also providing energy for you. At this point, you have to decide, if P amount of power is available at time T, how much of that should go to charge the batteries, how much of that should go to help the workload satisfy the needs, how much of the workload should come from the batteries, and so on. So it's an optimization problem based on prices, cost of battery. Batteries don't last forever. The more you use them, the less the longevity will be, and so on. So the number of different parameters have to be brought together. The reason to focus on space heating and cooling is that in a typical building, not just in the West but also in India, space heating and cooling takes about 40% of the energy. You may not realize that. Quite often the energy is wasted because everything is turned on, even though the occupancy of a large hall may be much less than the planned occupancy. In monitoring and measurement, why do we monitor and measure? We want to predict the energy needs. For example, Tata Power predicts on a daily basis and then corrects it on an hourly basis and uses it every 15 minutes. It's a gradual change or update to the planned load as and when information comes in. And they use prediction algorithms which are quite sophisticated, some of which IIT Bombay contributed to. Communication purposes, a panel to tell the user what the situation is, and so forth. And these are real pictures from some of the instrumented houses that our collaborators have gotten. PMUs I mentioned to you before are useful for wide area power control, distributed generation control, stability of voltage, post-event analysis. This is what has been used so far, these two things, post-event analysis and operator display. These are coming online with more modern communication links and algorithms. Okay, I'll skip through some technical details. There's fascinating algorithmic issues. Unfortunately, I don't have time for that. The other is in the database area. If you're somebody interested in databases, post-event analysis. This is what has been used so far, these two things, post-event analysis and operator display. These are coming online with more modern communication links and algorithms. Okay, I'll skip through some technical details. There's fascinating algorithmic issues. Unfortunately, I don't have time for that. The other is in the database area. If you're somebody interested in databases, distributed databases in particular, there's a lot of data being collected, and you would like to process them as soon as possible, as close to the origin as possible, rather than putting everything into one single centralized database and process it there. So how do you do that is one of the major issues. Unfortunately, how much time can I? About 5 minutes? 10 minutes. Very good. You're being very generous. So our goal is to optimize data communication without compromising the fidelity of applications. Okay, one interesting approach that's used here in our algorithms is the following. So I told you that frequency doesn't change much. You saw even in the picture. In normal steady state, frequency is the same from the last time you sampled. So we can use this to advantage. If the changes are much smaller than a delta depending on the nature of the query, I don't have to send you a new sample, right? If I convince you that my algorithm will send you a new sample only if it is larger than the change delta, you can be sure that the value that is not coming to you, that is missing from the stream, is within delta. We often use this in our day-to-day communication also, right? If you don't hear from me, assume that everything is okay. So same principle can be used here to advantage. And that will reduce the amount of bandwidth that I mentioned before required for communicating things. Of course, you have to make sure that any change that happens beyond delta is transmitted within real-time requirements. And of course, you want to process the queries and the subqueries at these aggregation nodes. So these are PMUs. These are these local phaser dispatch centers. And then higher above are the decision-making points. I showed you this picture before in a different form. So there is distributed processing going on at all levels. And what we want to do is something called in-network aggregation. Aggregate along the way and not push everything from bottom to top and do everything there. That will be unscalable. Any questions on this? I mentioned before, user feedback is important, because otherwise you'll assume that users are happy with what they see and what they have benefited in terms of comfort level, dollar cost or rupee cost, as the case may be, but they're really not. Privacy, as you saw before, is an important consideration. So we have come to the end of the talk almost. any research should benefit humanity in a large, broad sense or in a very specific sense. It should unravel truths and give ways by which livelihoods can improve. One way that we as researchers are expected to do this is by publishing and reporting evaluated research and obtain feedback from other peers as well as the community at large. From academia, you can't really impact the real world. So you have to have collaborators from industry, from NGOs, and other organizations who are likely to take your ideas, implement them, prototype them, deploy them, get feedback for you. So it's important to have a cadre of collaborators for a large project like this, which we do. So the opportunities lie in making the grid smarter, greener, and more efficient. And technically, we do that by leveraging sensing, communication, and computation. ICT's main ingredients. And the overall goal is to match the needs of suppliers and consumers of electricity. And the three technical components of this solution are continuous measurement of various parameters. And this is important, judicious location of the sensors. You don't want to throw sensors at will. I didn't get time to go through some of the slides on how do you locate sensors. Because it costs money to locate them all over the place. And more importantly, it costs time to propagate those updates from the sensors to the places where decisions are being made. So that collection has to be done judiciously and disseminated in the form of information or insights to people who make the decisions, service providers, consumers, aggregators, and the like. Consumers are important because they need to know how much benefits they are going to accrue. Decision makers because they decide how much generation happens where, how do you transmit power from one area of generation to another area of consumption. And at the bottom comes demand side energy management, which is a consumption point energy management. Any questions on this? The challenge is that the whole world is a grid. Every outlet that you come across in your homes, in your dorms, in your offices is part of the electrical grid now. Your rooftop becomes part of the grid. The more the number of such elements, the more difficult it becomes to harness it optimally, know where the problem areas are, and so forth. For example, think of the following situation. Now, wind farms are all over the place. And suddenly the wind dies in a certain area. The area that is being fed wind energy, especially from that farm, is going to be affected right away. The consumers should not know that wind energy is not available in this farm. So somebody has to make a decision very quickly to transfer the generation capacity from in one area to go to this area which has been affected by the lack of wind. These decisions are not easy to make. It's a cost-benefit analysis which has to be conducted in real time. What-if analysis has to be done. Tables have to be generated offline quite often, kept ready in case some old situation arises. Again, you can just apply the tables, suggestions, and keep going, or you have to do some analysis online. The less you do online, the better off you are in terms of computational requirements and delays. So, just like you sit with a laptop in an internet cafe and reach some location far away, seeing some real-time phenomenon develop, and you're part of the internet grid, the information grid, hereby plugging your device into the outlet closest to you, you're part of the electrical grid. And you know how long it's taken for the internet grid to reach where it is today in a stable form, much of the time. Whatever information you want is typically available at your fingertips. Same sort of reliability should be available in terms of energy. very interesting research issues arise.